Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to what's going to be our kind of culmination of this larger story that we've been telling about the history of America. Um, really, today we're going to be talking about the Civil War and everything. But before we get started, is there any questions regarding assignments? Remember, you were supposed to be doing the reading journal, um, or towards the final. Um, really, any questions whatsoever.
Yeah, I actually had a question for the reading journals.
Uh-huh.
Can you just briefly describe what you're looking for specifically? Because I got points taken off, and there was no real notification as to why. Um, maybe it was a lack of words because I know you have to write about 100 words.
Mhm.
They were close. Some of them weren't at 100 words, but I don't think that all the points were taken off. So could you just briefly describe what is needed for those?
So main thing is you're supposed to be um, saying your opinion about the uh, the readings, and it's supposed to be about 100 words per week. Um, I don't know your particular um, reading journal, so I couldn't say that. Um, Kevin, do you remember offhand what might have gotten points taken away?
Probably doing more summary than actually discussing opinion. Because
Okay, I think that's where I went wrong. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, main thing is that you're supposed to be saying what you think about it. So summarizing will is pretty much just a distraction, right? It doesn't, like, we already know what it says, so um, you know, we don't need to know. We want to know what you think. So yeah, don't summarize too much, otherwise that will get some points taken away.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions before we get started? All right. Well, let's. Oop, I need to hit the screen share. There we go. And please ignore my cat off in the making noise, because that is what a cat does. Um. So to today would have normally been a week long, but instead of having the entirety of next week off, they decided to make it so that they had voting day off. So this lecture is actually going to be split in two between weeks, just like the last one, because that's just how they decided to run things this semester. Uh, so today we're going to be talking about the Civil War. We last time we left off, the Civil War had actually started. If you remember, we had talked about the sectional crisis and the lead up to it, how slavery became more and more of an issue that divided the parties, sent the Whigs into a death spiral, and created a new sectionally aligned party called the Republicans, who brought out Abraham Lincoln, and with his election, the uh, the South seceded, but Lincoln was not going to. Well, first of all, Buchanan wouldn't let them secede. Um, willingly. He wasn't just going to let people um, just decide that they don't want to take their toys and go home, just because they didn't get what they wanted. Um, you know, so this was kind of an existential crisis for the Union, and Buchanan left a few forts in the South manned by the U.S. Army, and then um, Lincoln kind of forced the issue by saying, hey, I'm going to resupply this particular fort in South Carolina, and then the Confederacy answered by bombarding it, starting the Civil War, which is where we left off. So there was this real question if the South was allowed to just secede. This was no longer just about slavery. This was a broader question as to the very survival of the Union, because remember the Articles of Confederation had said very clearly that that the Union was perpetual, and then the new Constitution very clearly states for a greater union. So if people were allowed to just secede anytime they weren't getting their way, then how the heck could a union sustain itself? So to keep the Union together, even in the North, would mean having to make sure that the South could not secede. And especially considering they seceded on the issue of slavery, that made it particularly illegitimate in Northerners' eyes. So this really came down to trying to figure out what the Union meant. Was the Union just a batch of loosely aligned states, or was it a nation? Because up until this point, loyalties typically lied with people's states rather than America as a whole. And it's really the Civil War that would define a nation, as the subtitle of this goes. It really defined what it meant to be American. So was America a land of freedom and liberty and all those catchy words, or was it one of loosely aligned states that get to just do whatever they want? Obviously, the North kind of liked the idea of liberty. The South liked the idea of independence. But these two things were somewhat contradictory, and the Civil War was going to decide that contradiction. Come on, there we go. So remember, Lincoln had tried to had called for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months to just go quash these lower states from South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana and Texas. But then when he called up the troops, very specifically stating that they would march down south to put down the insurrection, these states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, seceded to join the Confederacy. And this is a pretty big deal because Virginia, which included West Virginia at this point, this is West Virginia right here, but at this point, West Virginia was actually part of Virginia, was kind of seen as like the leader of the South. So once they seceded, it was very clear that it was a Southern movement rather than just that what we had talked about before, the Gulf Confederacy. But now it's the entire Confederacy. So a lot of this initial fight would be over these border states. So the border states being Maryland, Delaware, what would become West Virginia, and we'll get to that, Kentucky, and Missouri. Kansas to a point, and also there were border territories as well. Indian Territory had basically its own civil war between the different tribes, and New Mexico, which, mind you, Arizona and a chunk of southern Nevada was actually part of New Mexico at this point, including the actual, like, this right here is where Las Vegas is today, and that was actually part of New Mexico. But the southern half of New Mexico actually seceded. They came together in Mesilla and said, we're now part of the Confederacy. So even this far west, there would be contention over who would be how far the Confederacy would extend, and these border states and border territories would decide that issue. So right off the bat, you can see this is not going to be a quick 3 months like Lincoln thought it would be. This is a long war, and would be the bloodiest war in American history, taking almost 1 million lives for both the South and North combined. So really, this came down to having to mobilize because obviously this is no longer just going to be 3 months. Especially once the army started meeting up, people started realizing this is a long-term war. So how the war was made determined how the war was fought. So up until this point, war was in the United States was mostly fought by militias. There was never really a large standing army, save for during the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, actual declared wars. But you can't declare war on yourself. So this is actually a huge war, but not a declared one. Essentially, the U.S. fought it like it was engaging, like it was trying to put down an insurrection, which is pretty much exactly what it was. It was an insurrection. But in fact, it is often by official records that were compiled after the war into a series of books. It is sometimes called the War of Southern Rebellion, which is what the actual primary source books that there's I think 68 of them, where the Union literally just compiled all the sources into one thing and called it the War of Southern Rebellion. So you can already see a kind of attitude developing that makes it very clear that it's about the Northern effort is about the Union. But the Southern effort is about trying to gain independence so that they can maintain slavery. So the first step after trying to gather that 75,000 volunteers is that is trying to figure out more ways of recruiting people, because clearly 75,000 volunteers is not going to be enough. So the first step was nationalizing militias. And what that entails is that basically the federal government says, no, now you are under, now your state militia is in control, is controlled by the U.S. Army. They're still technically separate, but normally counted as regular army. This was kind of how wars were fought up until this point. And in fact, the Confederacy actually did this first. So they nationalized their militias in late February of 1861. So even um, before fighting, before attacking Fort Sumter. Um, and so you can see even that is not enough. So eventually, in 1862, after a year of war, the South was the first to create conscription. Now, remember, we have talked about this before, that conscription actually was possible throughout this time, but it was only by the states, that states could conscript people into into their militias. And by the Militia Act of 1794, um, the federal government could demand state governments to do so, but it would still be on the state government to do so. Kind of like how we have just recently had an election, and it's the federal government says you have to have an election, but it's up to the state government to actually run the election. Same thing here. This is that kind of that difference between a full-on nation or a loose alignment of states, which up until the Civil War, it was very much just a loose alignment of states. But the Confederacy was actually the first one to realize that they couldn't just make it with by getting everyone to voluntarily join. And so in April of 1862, they initiated conscription, and the Union wouldn't follow suit until July of 1862. So there were a few months in there in which the Confederacy had conscription and not the Union. Of course, this led to draft riots in the North. And on the 13th of July, a year later, there was a significant amount of drafting going on in New York, and a series of riots, especially where there was a lot of. In fact, there's a movie called Gangs of New York that depicts this. That people started resisting the draft and basically just rioted and started shooting at each other. You can see pictured here, this actually happened. People, the New York militia had to be called in just to put it down, and they engaged in firefights on the streets of New York, including using cannons. The movie, by the way, mistakenly shows ships firing on the city. That's not true, though cannons were used. The ships were used to blockade the city. This meant that this riot ended up killing 120 people in New York. And there were minor conflicts throughout the North over conscription throughout the war. But this also meant, because the South had seceded over slavery and everything, people started targeting black people as because they didn't want to fight the war. And not that black people didn't want to fight the war, black people, we'll get to that, but that people did not want to fight the war, and so they targeted black people. They thought that this was a war for the Negro, and therefore it was the Negro that had to be attacked. And so throughout the war, we'll see a steady depopulation of New York of black people as they flee for other cities or for upstate New York. By the very quickly, that meant that they would go to places like Brooklyn, and that's why there's particular parts of New York that are considered to be more black than others is actually a result of all this violence. Um, so with all that being said, the South had its own troubles because they obviously saw this to be a war to preserve slavery. And so the people who were basically being fought on behalf, as in slave owners, um, often were given an exception known as the 20 Negro Law. And essentially, if you owned 20 slaves, then you were exempt from conscription. This was actually by the towards the end of the war, even made even worse by having it reduced to 15 slaves in 1864. Some people found this so important that they basically seceded from the secessionists. Another movie that depicts this is Free State of Jones, that recently came out. So you had all of these people being forced to join, and there's some resistance to it. But something that you have to remember with conscription is that it's actually more of a recruiting tool than an actual way to force people into the army, because most people actually volunteered for this war. But partially because of the existence of conscription, that they were, they thought that they were going to get conscripted anyway, so might as well volunteer. That's actually how conscription generally works, is that conscription normally tries to, takes in what isn't made up by volunteers. But because of the existence of conscription, more people volunteer. And throughout the rest of American history, because this is the first time that there's full-on federal conscription, but there'd be conscription in 1917, 1940 through in 1917 through 1918, and 1940 through 73. And at no point was the Army majority conscripted soldiers in any of that. So from 1862 to 1865, 1917 to 1918, 1940 to 73, at no point, despite the fact that conscription exists, was the majority of the Army conscripted. So that managed, with all of this combined, there managed to be about 2.1 million men served in the Union Army. And that's throughout the entire war, 2.1 million. It peaked in terms of the total number of people in service at any given point. It peaked at 600,000. But that's actually more than are in the Army today, despite the fact that we have several times more people in the United States and a very active Army today. So this is huge. This makes up a significant percentage of people in the North. But the South is actually even more of a percentage. Now, there's less Southerners total. There's less people in the Confederacy. But they're also fighting on their homeland. They're the home team, whereas the Union is on the offensive. So they don't exactly have people serving for explicit enlistments in that. They're just in it for the entire war. And so their effort peaked at 465,000 in 1863, and right around the same time that that the Union was peaking in terms of total number of people. But that stayed the same pretty much for the rest of the time, and so they had about 1 million people served throughout the war. But those 1 million people were serving for longer, so they were able to field larger armies than the Union at certain points, simply because they had so many people staying in service. But that also meant that they were going to become beleaguered, and there's a real argument that they didn't really have a chance to fight because of just the sheer amount of people that the North could field. You know, 2 million people versus 1 million people in the army are quite a different number. You know, approximately twice the number of people served in the Union than for the South. But another thing that that really changed who was serving in that is that if you're taken prisoner, technically you're still serving. And so the throughout the war, both the North and the South operated prisoner of war camps. And these POW camps were famously brutal, especially in a place called Andersonville, where 45,000 Union troops were housed in one giant camp in near Andersonville, and 13,000 of them would die. So think about how bad it has to be to have 13,000 people die as a resort out of 45,000, basically out of malnutrition. And so you can also see that there's pretty large numbers of POWs. Throughout the war, there would be about 400,000 POWs. So, you know, when we talk about 3 million people serving, there's also 400,000 of those who end up in POW camps. But that's just the sheer number of people. You also have to start dealing with basically the politics of war. So one of the first moves that remember when we've been talking about slavery, about abolitionists and all that, that a lot of it has been led by a group called the Unitarians. Well, a batch of Unitarians got together to create basically what would become a medical corps called the Sanitary Commission. And so this was based off of needing to kind of modernize the army, and especially to modernize medicine. We'll get to the technology of war in just a bit, but this is more of a social thing because the U.S. had observed a war going on in Europe back in 1855 called the Crimean War, and they had witnessed the creation of the Red Cross, and basically wanted to duplicate that. Red Cross obviously being a Christian symbol, but now considered just a medical symbol. And same thing here, you know, Unitarians are Christians, and so they wanted to basically do the same thing. And so the commission was set up to basically commission doctors and nurses. And throughout the war, there would be about 15,000 women who served as nurses. There were actually many more nurses than there were doctors. And so women were a significant part of this war effort as well, especially in the North. And so you have an explicit political organization to kind of wage the war and make sure that the people who are getting hurt are able to come back. But of course, there's also people who are very much against the war in the North. These people are called Copperheads, they're basically just Northern Democrats who were opposed to the war. Basically, the ones who wanted to just let the South secede. Um, they wanted peace at basically any cost. So that really translated to the border states having a lot of Copperheads, especially in Maryland. We had talked about it in this sectional crisis thing that we had talked about last lecture, where where Maryland almost voted to secede, and Lincoln basically imprisoned the legislature without the ability to be released. But he was also trying to put down the Baltimore riots and make it safe to travel to Washington, D.C. for congressmen. So Maryland had to be put down very tyrannically. But the same kind of drama played out in the other border states. For instance, Kentucky did not actually vote to secede, but half of her legislature actually split off to form their own Confederate government in exile, which meant that they started helping the Confederacy through basically moving their legislature around and declaring Kentucky was, even though it had voted to stay in the Union. And Missouri basically repeated what had happened in Kansas, but reversed. Now Missourians were the border ruffians were trying to attack their own people, especially the ones who wanted to stay in the Union, and a whole bunch of these what were called not bushwhackers. They were just guerrilla fighters, and we'll get to that part of the war later. But they basically formed guerrilla organizations that were actually funded by the Confederacy. And even as far away as California had a pretty large secessionist movement. Even though California was a free state, California had felt very much separate from the Union for a long time, because if you remember, California is way over here, whereas the next closest state is Kansas in 1861. And so also Oregon had become a state, but California had felt very much separate, and in fact had voted to split the state in 1859, but that didn't go through because of all this sectional stuff. But the southern half of California was fairly pro-slavery and also very violent. They had a very violent vigilance committee in Los Angeles. So the U.S. Army imposed martial law in California, and basically started trying to reconstruct them from that. But especially, it became a huge argument throughout California to try to keep California in the Union, because remember, California is also the gold-producing capital of the U.S. So all that mineral wealth will help pay for the Civil War. And so if California seceded, suddenly that huge source of revenue is lost. And so this guy named Thomas Starr King, who was a Unitarian and a Universalist preacher, went around California, basically arguing that it should stay in the Union. And there's a lot more factors than just one guy, but Lincoln thought that it was because of King that he had kept California in the Union. And remember, California is the mineral capital, so losing California might have lost the war. And so he called Thomas Starr King the preacher who saved the Union. So you have all that craziness, and then of course, because of concerns over California, that everyone had to figure out how they were going to finance the war. The Union effort would end up costing $5.2 billion, which is roughly 83 billion in today's money, maybe about 100 billion, which doesn't seem like much today, but you have to remember the main way that the federal government gained tax revenue was through importation duties, as in tariffs. And so that's not a very good source of revenue. It doesn't give you a lot of money. So the federal government's a pretty small entity at this point. And trying to finance this massive war effort would be difficult. The Confederacy's war effort would end up costing roughly a third of that, by the way. They were a lot more lean, because once again, they were fighting mostly on the home front. So, they were fighting in Virginia, and they were fighting in Tennessee and Louisiana. Although they would definitely go on the offensive a few times, and we'll get to how badly that went for them. So both the Union and the Confederacy decided to go with what's called fiat currency. Essentially, they said that the U.S. dollar wasn't that the U.S. dollar would not be connected to gold, at this point it was both gold and silver. It was a bimetallic system. But throughout the war, gold would not actually be correlated to the dollar. And the U.S. the Union created what were called greenbacks. It was paper money, pretty much the same idea as what we have today. But this was a radical new thing, because fiat currency isn't exactly stable. It's something that the U.S. can just print out as much as they want at no actual cost. So all that treasure coming from California doesn't actually doesn't get impacted. You still have the same amount of treasure no matter what. Because the cost of war ultimately comes down to the people who are fighting it, but also the what it takes to finance that war effort. So it's called blood and treasure, is what the cost of war is. That's how you measure the cost of a war. And this was by far the costliest war in American history, especially in terms of blood. Not so much in terms of treasure, but in other ways, we'll see that that the war effort cost treasure in different ways. especially manufacturing. So the Union created a higher tariff called the Morrill Tariff, um, which was actually part of the Republican Party platform. Remember, they wanted to create a transcontinental railroad and also start homesteading across the West. They were very much a westward-facing party, but from the North. And so they used the Morrill Tariff, as Morrill spelled Morrill, not moral as in like, having good and evil or whatever, but moral as in the name of the person who presented it on the Senate floor, House floor. And they also they had enough excess money that they did in fact start building the Transcontinental Railroad in 1862. And that same year they passed the Homestead Act. So they actually managed to push through the entire well, not all of it. Obviously they couldn't keep the Union immediately, so that was a huge failure of the Republican Party platform. But the main policy issues, as in stopping the expansion of slavery, with making a higher tariff so that they can pay for a railroad, and making homesteads throughout the West so that they can start making a profit from the land that way too, meant that, and basically colonizing the West, that meant that they actually had excess cash to pay for the war effort. The Confederacy was not so lucky. They were unable to really trade with foreign countries because the U.S. ended up blockading them, and they were not much of a manufacturing capital. So their answer to trying to pay for the war was to essentially seize any kind of goods from the local populace that would help the war effort, and to start the process of trying to industrialize. So remember, the Confederacy prior to Fort Sumter had raided a bunch of federal arsenals to try to gain weapons and all that, which really helped them be so well armed to begin with. And they started trying to create war manufacturing facilities in major cities. But when you're starting off with nothing, it's really hard to get to something, especially when you don't have the excess capital to finance all of that, which the Morrill Tariff in the North had allowed the Republicans to do so. So you can already see that we're talking about a very different kind of warfare, what's called, what we can call modern warfare. Up until this point, it's a very different kind of warfare when you're talking about just sheer numbers of people that you can throw into the field. It's not so much about tactics, it's more about how much you can field. And the Union was definitely had the biggest advantage in this regard. The Union had 18.5 million residents, and the border states had another 2.5 million, with roughly 500,000 people who were enslaved. So that's that means that the Union had a much larger ability to field people. They had roughly 21 million people that they can call upon. Although, mind you, half of that population is women, and you can't recruit. At this point, women do not serve in the army. but the numbers are far worse for the Confederacy because they only had 5.5 million free residents. And that's on top of having 3.5 million enslaved people. So they they had to worry about slave revolts and all that. So there's a lot of people who end up staying to control slavery. So remember we had talked about the 20 Negro law and all that prevented um, conscription of really upper class people in the Confederacy. But they needed those upper class people to continue to produce goods, as in produce wealth that would end up feeding the war effort. So the Confederacy is at a major disadvantage. But notice we're talking still tiny numbers when we're talking about 2 million people who served in the North and 1 million in the South. When that comes out to 21 million that they're pulling from and 5.5 million that they're pulling from in the South, that's a huge amount of people who they're having to pull from the population. And of course, manufacturing the weapons of war, and and supplying them and getting goods to that war effort and being able to have some sort of command and control mechanism was also definitely in the North's favor. So in 1860, in Union states, there was 22,000 miles of railroad. Although by the end of the war, that would actually increase to 29,000. And the Confederacy only had 9,000. So less than half the mileage of railroads, and railroads are really useful to getting people moving troops around and moving goods around and getting things everywhere much quicker than they could by just ox carts. So you have a mechanized way of moving things around that is very clearly in the North's favor, and especially the North would end up attacking the railroads of the South to the point that most of it would end up getting destroyed during the war in the South. So, railroads very clearly favor the North, and the same thing goes with telegrams, which were telegraphy was typically built right next to the railroad, and so you can see that the telegraph very much favored the North, and this gave them a way of unifying a war effort rather than having it all regional. The telegraph is a instantaneous means of communication, basically. It's not actually instantaneous because you have to relay it. But the North had electrical telegraphy and visual telegraphy, whereas the South only had a little bit of it. In fact, Lincoln would spend hours a day just sitting in the telegraph office that was across the way from the White House. And he'd just sit there swapping stories with guys operating a lot of the telegraph system at this point was operated by the U.S. Postal Service, and especially when a lot of it got nationalized for the war effort, the U.S. Postal Office was running it. So he just sat there just swapping stories with all the post guys who were now part of the Army. And the actual weapons of war had advanced significantly since the Revolution. No longer were they these cumbersome and unreliable flintlock mechanisms. They were now basically all cap and ball, which how you operate a cap and ball. Let me switch to camera. Hold on. There we go. So how you can operate a cap and ball is that you essentially have a pan, or what's called a frizzen, that's flintlock. How you operate a flintlock is that you have a frizzen that you dump powder into, and then you dump powder down the barrel and down, and then a bullet down the barrel, which is normally just a ball. And so the flintlock essentially has a piece of flint that strikes up at a piece of metal that's above the frizzen, and it just scrapes a little bit of flint off and lights that pan. You can understand if it's raining, it won't work. If it's gotten wet, it won't work. If that strike doesn't really work, you're gonna have to recock. You could also have it that what's called a flash in the pan, if you've ever heard that term, is basically that the pan flashes but doesn't get into the barrel. So it's a very unreliable mechanism. But cap and ball essentially replaces all that pan stuff with a little cap that, if I had thought about it, now that I'm home, I could actually bring out some of this stuff. Since we can't show this kind of thing in the classroom, but we can show it here. But it's a little cap that you put on a little nipple that you just put it on like that, and then all it takes is a hard smack from a hammer, and it's pretty much a guaranteed ignition. Sometimes there can be gunk in the nipple, but that's really the only unreliable part of it. Today's cartridges, as in like if you ever see a bullet, it's actually a cartridge, and a cartridge has I think I might have something, I don't know where, but today's cartridge is essentially just a brass case that has one of these caps at the base of it. So we're still basically operating cap and ball weapons today. And the other significant part is what's called the mini ball, which is the shape of the bullet. It's derived from a French design from 1849 by a guy named Minier. But Americans just mispronounced his name and thought that it meant small, as in mini. It actually comes from his name, Minier. But essentially, a Minier ball, well, here's a good example. Take this. A Minier ball is kind of like this, where this is just a microphone cover, but it has this rounded tip, but then it has a flat back, often with a bit of an opening in there. So even though this is a microphone thing, imagine if it was made out of lead, and that's essentially what a mini ball is. And these things were such an advancement in terms of how deadly guns could be, because suddenly they were able to, having that little opening in the back allowed them, when they were fired, to open up and connect to the rifling. Oh, all right, there we go. Hold on. You gotta say it yourself so that you come up.
Here's a mini ball if you guys want to look at it.
Let me go find a bullet real quick.
Pretty sure this one's from the actual Civil War.
All right, found a bullet. So essentially, hold on, why is it not? There we go. Pin video. There you go. So a bullet today has a cap. That's a cap that would normally be sitting on a nipple rather than on a cartridge like this. But cartridge is like this actually started being used during this war as well. But the main thing is the shape of this bullet allows it to connect to the edges of a rifled barrel. And what that means is that when the bullet gets launched out, it connects to the rifling and twists. And this makes it far more accurate as it's flying. This made the range that you could engage quite far, and made it so that the fire was far more accurate. So with all of that, let's get back to the slide. You can see with these rifles, but also, the sheer amount of dead people, that this is what the Captain Ball is, and it would allow them to engage at much further ranges. Notice that this picture has them hiding behind a barrier. When you weren't using mini balls, most of the time, people had to get really close to actually shoot at each other. Typical engagement range during the Revolutionary War was 100 yards. That's a football field. The Civil War, you can pretty much engage at 500 yards. Not very accurately, but you can do the same kind of volley fire at 5 football fields distance. So you can see this is a totally different kind of warfare, just by the technology of it. But also the way that it was fought. So the Confederacy was pretty much on the defensive most of the time. Soldiers in the Confederate Army thought that they were fighting for independence. They were essentially fighting for the preservation of slavery because that's why they were declaring independence. But to them, it didn't matter. They just wanted independence. And so there is a way of keeping morale in the South that isn't present in the North, because the North was basically just trying to keep the Union together. So most of the people fighting really didn't care about slavery. And, a lot of Northerners were perfectly fine with the continuation of slavery. They were just worried about the Union falling apart, but that's not much of a reason to fight. So there's a lot more people willing to fight in the South than in the North. And they have a far easier way of boosting morale. And you also have to think this is a really nasty war, not just in terms of the technology of it, the sheer mechanical view of war, where it's just about turning a fire hose of people on each other, but also just the people who are fighting each other, because it's often called a war of brother against brother, and in some cases that is a very real statement, because people had divided loyalties. Some people thought that it was right for some people in the North thought it was right to for the South to secede, and they would actually go and join the South, and vice versa, that a lot of Southerners refused the right of the South to secede, and so they went and joined the Northern Army. For instance, the governor of Texas had actually fought against secession, and he stepped down um, because Texas voted to secede. Um, that being Houston. Um, so um, the this is a really nasty war, just in terms of the fact that people have to choose their loyalty, and this can divide up families, um, especially in the border states. A lot of those border states that we talked about. Go back, come on. No. A lot of these border states would end up having um, families split along with their loyalties. Um, and so those border states saw a lot of what's called irregular warfare, as in people who are not part of the regular army, and like basically form their own units, or were just fighting as guerrillas. And in even though there was regular forces were the vast majority of forces that would be engaged, there was this irregular warfare throughout the border states. And it's also that in terms of irregular warfare, especially in terms of guerrilla warfare, it's not necessary to win any major battle. The whole point is to hold on, loud car. The whole point is to simply beleaguer your opponent until they give up. And there was also even further, there was espionage, which is not technically warfare, but both sides engaged spies, especially in civilian centers. In fact, the Confederacy would end up using arsonists throughout New York on several occasions, that they would actually send people to New York to burn it just through arson. And one of these espionage groups were called the Pinkertons, who would become a private detective agency after the war. And they ended up also forming a group of people to protect U.S. currency, because remember, there's that whole fiat currency thing, and both sides engaged in basically counterfeiting to try to destabilize each other's currency. And so the Pinkertons started their as a spy agency, and they also tried to protect the U.S. currency by forming the Secret Service, the same Secret Service we have today. Its primary duty is not protecting the president, but protecting currency. To stop, and it was formed by Pinkertons to stop currency fraud. So you can see this kind of warfare is very different. It's not about so much about like lines on a map and that. It's more about just the sheer amount of people you can throw out there, how much blood and treasure you can spend, and who has the technological advantage as well. So the U.S. had to come up with a grand strategy for the war, because obviously that whole 75,000 volunteers thing wasn't going to work after the northern half of the Confederacy seceded. And so you remember, we've talked about Winfield Scott a few times already. He's been a pretty major force in the U.S. Army since the War of 1812. Well, his final contribution to the U.S. Army before quitting in 1861, he'd die a year later, just from he's a very old man at this point, very fat. He's just a fat old general. But he comes up with what's called the Anaconda Plan. So the basic idea of the Anaconda Plan is that the Union would use its its navy, since it's got such a superior navy, um, to blockade the South from trading. It would take all the seaports first to try to make sure that you know these sea forts are places like Fort Sumter, um, so that they can control the bay of all these places. And then they would try to stop blockade runners, people who were trying to get the cotton and other kinds of raw material that would sell on and help pay for the Confederacy. They would try to escape the blockade. And there would be around 2.5 to 3,000 blockade running attempts. And they were mostly successful. They had about an 80% successful rate, especially in the early years when the blockade was getting set up and the sea forts hadn't been taken. The Union would capture around 1,000 blockade runners, especially ones that were trying to return, and destroyed more than 350 vessels during all this. And the Confederacy got so desperate that they ended up trying to use submarines. Problem with submarines at this point is there isn't really a good way of breathing, and so the submarines were hand paddled, and so these people would try to go and hit a the ship in the bay or whatever, and then suffocate as they tried to do it. Didn't exactly work out for them. Submarines wouldn't really be an effective war device until World War I. And so that's the first part of the Anaconda Plan, is to set up this blockade. The next part is to split the Confederacy. You can see in this picture the Winfield Scott's Great Snake. That the idea is take all of this and then head down the Mississippi, and take the Mississippi and split the Confederacy, so that Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas are no longer able to stay in contact with these Eastern Confederacy. That didn't work out. That didn't really get followed by the Lincoln administration. While Lincoln certainly let the generals try to control the sea forts, for instance, taking Fort Monroe in August of 1861, which allowed them to start engaging in what were called contraband decrees, where they would actually allow slaves to escape into Union hands, but did so as contraband of war. This didn't really become the main strategy, because Lincoln, from Washington, D.C. here, saw the capital of the Confederacy right here in Richmond, as just over the river. Why don't we go after that? So he would actually ignore the Anaconda Plan for a good 2 years until it would be the strategy that won the war. So the Confederacy also engaged in basically the same kind of, I guess you could call it guerrilla naval warfare, but sea raiding that had been successful for the U.S. during the Revolution. As in, they started they started officially using privateers on the 17th of April, 1861. And this basically meant that people were given what's called a letter of marque and said, go ahead and raid all Union shipping. Go give them hell. and and in fact, one of these raiders, who was actually part of the Confederate Navy, the CSS Shenandoah, would actually be the last to surrender of all of the Confederacy. They they ended up doing somewhere around the lines of $300 million in damage. And in fact, because the British would end up helping their war efforts by selling by private entities in Britain selling ships to the Confederacy, Britain had to pay $15 million in damages because of all this in 1871, well after the war, which is roughly around $320 million today. So, this is the premier strategy, is to keep the Confederacy from being able to engage in any kind of significant naval warfare or trading, while they have privateers and they have blockade runners and whatnot. Mostly the blockade was successful, but the whole splitting up down the Mississippi was late to come. That wouldn't come until 1863. And we don't really have much time, but the next part of the war really lied in how it would develop diplomatically, as in with foreign countries, because if France or Britain had intervened in this war, especially on the Confederate side of the war, we wouldn't be looking at the United States as we do today. It would just be the northern states. Because if Britain or France had intervened, that would be the deciding factor to allow the Confederacy to do well. But they never did, and we'll get to that next time. We have about 2 minutes left. Is there any questions? Let me turn off screen share. Any questions whatsoever? Well, we have 1 minute left, so if anybody does want to ask a question, go ahead. But otherwise, I will see you guys next time.